There was no announcement, no ceremony, no formal declaration of any kind. And yet, the moment Prince William stepped into view, something shifted so completely that even those who had spent decades studying the royal family struggled to find the right words for what they were witnessing. The cameras caught it first, the stillness in his posture, the measured pace of his steps, the quiet, unshakable control in the way he moved through the space around him. This was not a man preparing for power. This was a man who had already claimed it. And what happened next inside the palace walls was something the institution had never quite experienced before. But here's the part that nobody is talking about openly. The reaction from Camilla's inner circle was not calm, it was not composed, and it was not what the public image of royal unity would have you believe. Because behind those carefully managed appearances, something was breaking apart. And the speed at which it was happening had caught almost everyone off guard. So what really happened the moment William stepped forward? And did the monarchy quietly cross a line it can never walk back from without a single word being said? Keep watching, because this story is only just beginning to surface. A presence that needed no title. There are moments in history where a shift in power does not announce itself with fanfare or formal language. It simply happens, and everyone in the room feels it simultaneously without being able to explain exactly why. What Prince William produced in that single public appearance was precisely that kind of moment. Something intangible but completely undeniable settled over the scene the instant he arrived. He carried no new title that day. No ceremonial upgrade had been issued. No senior advisor had stepped forward to signal a change in the chain of command. And yet the atmosphere responded to him differently than it ever had before. His tone carried a weight that was new. His expressions were more deliberate, more considered, more final. Every gesture seemed to operate from a place of settled authority rather than inherited expectation. The people watching him, seasoned royal commentators, insiders with decades of palace experience. For those watching closely, the realization was immediate. This was not preparation anymore. This was not rehearsal. What stood before the world in that moment was not the Prince of Wales performing a supporting role. It was something far closer to a king already in motion, operating without the formal title, but with every bit of the weight that title carries. And within palace walls, that visibility sent a ripple through the institution that no carefully worded statement could fully smooth over. The blindsiding of Camilla's circle. What unfolded in public did not stay there for long. As the significance of William's appearance settled across headlines and conversations around the world, the reaction inside the palace began to take shape. And it was considerably more charged than anything the official image of royal unity was designed to contain. Within the inner circle surrounding Queen Camilla, the shift landed hard. Those familiar with the internal atmosphere described something that moved quickly from confusion to quiet alarm, and then into something heavier and more difficult to name. This was not simply a matter of optics or public perception. It struck at something far more personal: the timing, the control, and the sudden dawning awareness that events were no longer unfolding at a pace that anyone in that circle could comfortably manage. For Camilla, the moment carried a particular weight that went beyond institutional politics. She had spent decades navigating her path toward this position. The scrutiny had been relentless. The public hostility, especially in the years following Diana's death, had been fierce and sustained. She had endured it with patience and a discipline that few outside the palace fully appreciated. And she had finally arrived, standing at the center of the monarchy beside King Charles III, her role formally established, her position seemingly secure. Then, without a single word of warning, the ground beneath that position appeared to shift. Not through any direct action against her, not through an open confrontation or a formal restructuring, but through something more unsettling than either of those things. Attention had begun to move. Authority, even if unofficial and unspoken, was visibly gathering around William in a way that created an entirely new center of gravity within the institution. Insiders suggested that what made the situation feel so destabilizing was not the shift itself, but how unexpectedly exposed it had become. There had been a shared understanding within the palace that any transition of this nature would be managed carefully. It would be timed with precision. Those close to Camilla reportedly experienced the moment as a form of quiet sidelining, not through deliberate action, but through the unstoppable logic of circumstance and perception. As William's visibility grew, the contrast it created was impossible to ignore. Where focus had previously been distributed across the senior members of the royal household, it was now pulling steadily and unmistakably toward the next generation. And with that pull came a question that nobody in Camilla's circle was quite ready to answer. If this was happening now, earlier than anyone had anticipated, what exactly was coming next? Conversations inside the palace became noticeably more careful after that, observations more guarded. Every gesture, every scheduling decision, every shift in tone began to carry a significance that it might not have carried before. Because those inside the institution understood something that the public had not yet fully processed. The balance had not simply tilted. It had begun to tip in a direction that was going to be very difficult to reverse. The decision that drew a line. As the internal atmosphere grew more strained, one specific development rose above the general tension and demanded attention in its own right. It was not a new controversy, but it was being handled in a way that felt unmistakably different from anything that had come before. The situation surrounding Prince Andrew, which had followed the monarchy like a shadow for years and repeatedly tested the institution's ability to project stability and integrity, was entering a new phase. And the tone of that new phase was being set by William. Behind closed doors, the conversations around Andrew had reportedly sharpened considerably. Where previous approaches had leaned toward careful management, gradual distancing, and the kind of slow institutional retreat that allows everyone to maintain a degree of dignity. The direction being pushed now was more direct and more final. Those familiar with the internal discussions described William as firm, focused, and showing very little patience for prolonged deliberation on a matter he appeared to view as already settled. The position was clear. Prince Andrew needed to withdraw from public royal duties completely and permanently. Not as a temporary measure, not as a cautious. The deeper implication was one that nobody inside the palace could easily dismiss. If a decision of this magnitude, involving a senior member of the royal family, could be initiated and carried through with this level of resolve and this little hesitation, it meant that William's influence within the institution was already operating well beyond the boundaries of his formal title. He was not waiting. He was not deferring. He was already shaping outcomes in the present tense. And that realization settled over the palace with the quiet but unmistakable weight of something permanent. The tension that stopped being invisible. As the internal dynamics of the palace continued to shift, a particular fault line began to emerge with increasing clarity. It was not announced in any press release. It did not surface in any official statement. But for those paying close attention to the details that official statements never quite managed to contain, it was becoming harder and harder to look past. The evolving relationship between Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Queen Camilla had entered territory that quiet diplomacy was struggling to navigate. What had once been managed through careful scheduling, measured public appearances, and the kind of studied politeness that royal training produces at a very high level, was beginning to show pressure points that no amount of careful management could fully conceal. The moments that drew the most attention were not dramatic confrontations. They were subtler than that. Appearances that should have projected unity instead carried the feeling of something carefully constructed rather than naturally expressed. Positioning during events seemed deliberate in ways that had not previously been necessary. Who stood where, who was photographed beside whom, who spoke first and who waited. These details were being read by observers as signals rather than coincidences. One of the most discussed examples came during the state visit of Donald Trump and Melania Trump, an occasion that should have been a straightforward exercise in diplomatic ceremony. Beneath the surface of that event, however, something else was unfolding. Catherine drew significant public attention in a way that felt organic and immediate. Her interactions with Melania Trump placed her naturally at the center of the visual and emotional narrative of the visit. The cameras followed her with an ease that reflected genuine public interest rather than manufactured positioning. For Camilla, the experience reportedly felt different. The spotlight appeared to shift in ways that were difficult to ignore, and details that might otherwise have seemed inconsequential, wardrobe choices, timing of arrivals, placement within group settings, were being interpreted within palace circles as carrying a significance beyond the personal. These were seen as reflections of status, of direction, and of a future that was beginning to assert itself in the present. The response behind closed doors was telling in its own quiet way. Palace staff began adjusting schedules with more deliberate care, limiting the occasions where direct coordination between the two was required to only what was absolutely necessary. It was a practical solution to a situation that had moved beyond the reach of informal resolution. But practical solutions of this kind do not emerge without cause, and their emergence signals something important about the depth. The monarchy was no longer operating as a single, unified front, and the distance between its present and its future was growing more visible by the day. A vision for a different kind of crown. As the divisions within the palace became harder to ignore, something else was also taking shape. A clearer picture of where William intended to take the monarchy once the transition became official. And what emerged from his public remarks, his interviews, and the accounts of those who understood his thinking was a vision that represented a genuine departure from what had come before. William had made his position increasingly clear over time. He did not reject the monarchy's history or dismiss the traditions that had defined it across centuries, but he also did not treat those traditions as untouchable or beyond examination. In his view, the institution's survival depended on its ability to remain relevant to the world outside palace walls, and remaining relevant required something that previous generations of royals had rarely been asked to demonstrate openly: the willingness to change deliberately and on purpose, rather than only when forced. Insiders and royal commentators began describing an emerging model that felt noticeably different from anything the modern monarchy had previously offered. Ceremonies would retain their place, but would likely become leaner and more purposeful. The emphasis would shift away from spectacle and toward meaning. Public engagements would not be measured primarily by visibility, but by impact. The goal was not to be seen everywhere, but to matter somewhere. Fewer appearances with clearer purpose behind each one. Discussions around his future coronation reflected this thinking directly. The idea of a significantly scaled-back ceremony had been circulating within palace planning circles, and it aligned precisely with the broader direction William had been signaling through his leadership style. This was not about austerity for its own sake. It was about redefining what the monarchy's symbols were meant to communicate. Grandeur for its own sake was a language the institution could no longer afford to speak fluently if it wanted to hold the attention and trust of a public whose expectations were evolving rapidly. There was also a structural dimension to his approach that set it apart from simple aesthetic preference. William appeared to favor a more systematic way of evaluating the institution's practices. Long-standing processes would be reviewed, not because they were old, but because their continued usefulness could no longer simply be assumed. If a practice no longer served the institution effectively, its historical longevity would not be sufficient justification for its preservation. This was the thinking of someone approaching the monarchy less as a sacred inheritance and more as a living institution that had to earn its place in each new era. The underlying message that this vision carried was one that observers found both compelling and quietly unsettling, depending on where they stood within the institution. The monarchy could not afford to stand. What made this transformation particularly significant was how naturally it aligned with the changes that were already visibly underway. The consolidation of decision-making, the reduced tolerance for institutional distraction, the growing emphasis on clarity over comfort. all of it pointed in the same direction. This was not a continuation of the familiar order with minor adjustments at the edges. This was the careful and deliberate construction of something new, being built in real time by someone who had already decided exactly what he wanted it to become. The woman who changed the balance. As William's vision for the monarchy took clearer shape, a second story was developing alongside it, quieter in its unfolding but equally significant in its implications. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was becoming something that no formal title had yet officially defined. A stabilizing center around which public confidence was quietly gathering, even as the institution itself moved through one of the most turbulent periods in its recent history. Her public appearances had taken on a different quality. They were not marked by dramatic gestures or bold statements. What they carried instead was a consistency that seemed to lower the temperature of the room wherever she entered it. In moments when royal scrutiny grew intense or uncertainty about the future became pronounced, her presence had a calming effect on the public narrative that was difficult to manufacture and impossible to fake. People responded to her in a way that went beyond appreciation for the role she occupied. They responded to her as someone they trusted, and that trust had not been handed to her. It had accumulated slowly through years of behavior that remained steady, even when steadiness required considerable personal effort. Observers noted that this growing influence was not incidental. It reflected a balance she had developed between being visible and being restrained, between engaging fully with public life and never appearing to seek the spotlight for its own sake. She did not dominate attention. She shaped the emotional register through which the monarchy was received by ordinary people, and that was a form of influence that formal authority structures could not easily replicate or replace. Her personal health challenges during this period added a layer to the public's relationship with her that no strategic communication plan could have produced. Rather than diminishing her role, the difficulties she navigated openly created a connection rooted in something more durable than admiration. People saw in her someone who was dealing with real and painful circumstances while continuing to show up with composure and purpose. That combination of vulnerability and resilience produced a depth of public goodwill that was becoming one of the monarchy's most valuable assets at precisely the moment when it needed reliable sources of public trust most urgently. Within the broader structure of the institution, Catherine's evolving presence did not go unnoticed by those who spent their careers reading the internal currents of the royal household. As William continued to consolidate his approach to leadership, her role began to complement his instincts in ways that appeared for Queen Camilla and those within her circle. This gradual repositioning carried consequences that were felt even without being openly discussed. The monarchy's public image was no longer distributed evenly across its senior figures in the way it once had been. It was concentrating more visibly and more consistently around William and Catherine as a combined presence. And that concentration was changing the internal balance in ways that no amount of careful scheduling or diplomatic management could fully offset. The monarchy was beginning to orbit a new center, and the gravity of that shift was already being felt by everyone inside the institution, whether they were ready to acknowledge it or not. The reign that has not yet been named. As everything described above continued to accumulate and compound, attention began to turn toward the horizon. What had once been discussed as a future eventuality was now being spoken about in present tense terms by people inside and outside the palace. The transition was no longer abstract. It was no longer distant. It was arriving in pieces, through individual decisions and shifting dynamics and quiet consolidations of influence, even before the formal moment that would make it official. The expectation within the institution was that when the transition occurred, it would happen without delay. There would be no prolonged interregnum, no extended period of ambiguity about where authority resided. William would assume the role of king immediately, and the structure of leadership would shift with the same decisive clarity that had come to characterize his approach to everything else. A first national address was being considered in terms of tone and direction, with the emphasis firmly on clarity, reassurance, and the articulation of a forward-looking purpose rather than a backward-looking tribute to what had come before. The question of the coronation reinforced the same direction. All indications pointed toward a ceremony that would be significantly more restrained than anything the modern monarchy had previously staged. Not stripped of meaning, but stripped of excess. A deliberate signal in the language of symbol and spectacle that this reign would measure itself differently from those that preceded it. Relevance over grandeur. Purpose over display. A monarchy that justified its place not through the weight of tradition alone, but through the active demonstration of its value to the country it served. But beneath these structural considerations lay a question that carried far more emotional weight than any of the practical planning discussions. What would happen to Queen Camilla? Her position, which had seemed firmly established alongside King Charles III, now appeared considerably less certain when viewed through the lens of what was coming. Conversations within royal circles had begun to reflect a quiet but growing concern about how her role would be defined under William's leadership, and whether the continuity she had worked so long to establish would survive the transition intact or be quietly reshaped into something she had not chosen and could not control. The tension between two different perspectives on this question was becoming a source of real internal pressure. On one side stood the weight of personal loyalty and long-standing relationship, the dimension shaped by Charles's own feelings and the human reality of a marriage and a shared life. On the other side stood William's increasingly structured